From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
But I do think we're at a place where to hold specific Christian commitments is now no longer even sort of a net neutral or net positive. It's seen as perhaps even antagonistic to broad societal perceptions of the common good.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Miles Smith, Assistant Professor of History here at Hillsdale College, and also author of the new book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. We'll talk in depth with Dr. Smith about that book on today's program. Dr. Smith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Scott.
I want to begin by, this is at the very beginning of the book, and it's something that probably should be addressed. We do it now. The issue of the phrase, the hot phrase, Christian nationalism. And this is not really what the book's about. And you say at the beginning, throw it aside. It should be set aside by historians and ministers alike, you say, because at this point it means nothing at all. So this is not a book about Christian nationalism per se.
No, it's not. It's sort of getting at maybe the debate that has prompted people to embrace the term Christian nationalism. But I don't like the term. I don't think it's particularly useful. I don't think it describes anything. And so even the kind of embrace of it by people on the right, I think it's a bit of a waste of time because it obfuscates more than it clarifies.
So let's talk about a different phrase.
Okay.
Because early on in Religion and Republic, you say that the United States was a republic of Christians that were committed to what you have chosen to call Christian institutionalism. So how do you define Christian institutionalism?
Christian institutionalism is sort of what you might call normal American life up until the last 20 years or so. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina, and there was Presbyterian Hospital right uptown in a neighborhood off uptown in Elizabeth. And a couple of my cousins were born there. You're from Chicago. There's quite a few Catholic high schools.
All right, indeed.
In Chicago.
I went to one.
Yeah, and you attended one. So I think Christian institutionalism is Christians who took institutions seriously. Hospitals, churches, schools, even, for example, institutions that were political. It doesn't mean those institutions were baptized, but it does mean that, for example, there were chaplains in the military and in Congress, that the United States understood itself to be externally, at least presenting to the world, Christian institutional commitments. That doesn't mean it's a national, a nation or a sort of sacralized, sacred nation at all. It just means that it was largely people by Christians who took those institutions that they experienced in their day-to-day lives seriously, and they took their Christian commitments in those institutions seriously.
So what does the Constitution say about this? You know, a wall between religion and state and no established. Yeah. What does the Constitution say? Did it help to establish an order or a framework for this Christian institutionalism to flourish?
So the Constitution never says anything about a wall. That's a letter from Thomas Jefferson to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut in 1802. What the Constitution says is that there won't be a religious test. It means that we can't ask you if you're part of a specific religion if you're holding federal office. It also means that there's broad, we today call it toleration. What we should probably think of it as protection for Christian liberties, for Christian institutions. It's not the Constitution's job to tolerate churches. It's the Constitution's job to protect churches and synagogues and mosques and temples of, say, Hindu or Buddhist Americans. So we call it toleration. What it really means is protection. If your religious views are compatible with American liberties, we will protect you. Now, that doesn't mean you can have, say, a church that sacrament is active sedition, but it does mean that there's broad toleration. It's not an unlimited toleration. The Constitution doesn't give that, but it is broad toleration, and it created a pretty free, liberal, democratic order where a lot of religious groups were able to have flourishing lives as religious communities, Protestant first, and then Catholics and Jews and other groups as well. So it might have began as a Protestant community, but it didn't end that way. And that's important.
Miles Smith with us, his new book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. Disestablishment, you say, was the law of the land. It served us well, it served Christianity well, but it's a source of confusion and controversy. So why is it so hard for us to understand what that means?
We tend to think of disestablishment as a commitment to secularism or irreligiosity, meaning we think of disestablishment as meant to take religion out of politics or religion out of the social and civil spheres. What disestablishment was meant to do was to say the government won't support a specific churchly institution financially or give that particular churchly institution specific prerogatives, specific legal, civil, or social prerogatives. So if I'm an Anglican and someone else is a Lutheran or someone else is a Catholic or someone else is a Jew, the government can't give me a special status because of my religion. It doesn't mean that my religion can't inform things I might do politically.
The bulk of Religion and Republic then looks at a number of signposts through most of the 1800s. We're talking founding to the Civil War. That reflects the thesis of the book, of course. It begins with Thomas Jefferson. You've already mentioned Jefferson from his letter in 1802, president, of course, and his separationist ideology. So how did Jefferson navigate the powers of the presidency while having the separationist ideology?
Jefferson really doesn't like churches. That's one thing to know about him. He doesn't necessarily hate religion. He actually thinks very highly of Jesus Christ, and he likes a lot of Christian moral precepts, but he doesn't like the historic idea of churches, which he thinks are wrapped up in medieval ideologies. And he would have included Protestant and Roman Catholic churches in that. So during his presidency, there's nothing that really comes up that forces him to deal too much with it. But there are some things that occur in his post-presidency, dealing with the hiring of the faculty at the University of Virginia, his own relationship with Presbyterian ministers in particular in the state of Virginia. So in his presidency, there's not a lot. But in his life, there's quite a bit. So he had a pretty rambunctious relationship with particularly churchmen, meaning pastors, priests, and the churches as institutions themselves.
What do you make of that letter that's often quoted, and many think it comes from the words of the Constitution, but comes from this Jefferson letter? What's the context around that, and how do you see what he was trying to say? Is he misinterpreted in a way?
He is misinterpreted in the sense that Jefferson was actually very comfortable with what we might think of Christian influence in politics. He's not trying to get rid of that. He's uncomfortable with churchly influence. He doesn't want a minister using their authority as a minister to move politics, to move someone's opinion, because he thinks that's hearkening back to medieval superstition. He uses the phrase priestcraft a lot, right? So for him, anytime you would look to a Christian minister of any sort, be it a Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran, whatever it might have been, if you were looking to them for political guidance, you were engaging in a sort of almost retrograde political mission. You were sort of going back to the medieval era that Jefferson sort of thought the American Revolution had thrown off. And so he says a lot about this. Jefferson doesn't like the medievals very much. And so for him, the United States is a free republic that has thrown off all of those things. So any sort of movement by churches to exercise political power, he views as retrograde.
Miles Smith with us, his new book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. Another one of these chapters covers courts. And you say in this era, we have a court-protected Christianity. American judges see themselves as perpetuating Christian commitments within the judicial institutions of the United States. So what are these judges, what are the courts looking at as they interpret laws, as they make their decisions? Where are they finding sort of the bearings to make those rulings?
So to begin with, you have to ask who the judges are. Most of them, there's a famous story that most college-educated history people might recall, that the midnight judges. John Adams knows he's leaving office, so he sits up. He doesn't actually do it on one night, but he sits up in the middle of the night and makes all these men judges, particularly Federalists, oftentimes, but not always from New England, but usually Federalists. And so most of the Federalists appointed judges are men who are more comfortable with the idea that Christianity is infused into English common law. So those are men who basically say, well, of course, Christianity is part and parcel of common law. And Jefferson actually has an argument over this himself. Jefferson is incensed about all these judges. But what it means is that the Federalists who are sort of forming the court system actually understand that Christianity is kind of part and parcel of the legal structure of the United States. And so they set out to protect it that way. And it sort of ends up being not a state religion, but it ends not a churchly religion. They're not protecting churches. They're protecting this idea that Christian institutional commitments are worked out in the American legal framework.
We'll pause there. Dr. Miles Smith with us. His new book, Religion and Republic. You can find it at hillsdale.edu/podcast. In the meantime, if you haven't heard yet, there is a brand new episode of The Larry Arnn Show now on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. Podcast.hillsdale.edu. Then look for The Larry Arnn Show. The new episode features a conversation between Dr. Arnn and the Lincoln scholar and historian Alan C. Gelzo. They discuss his new book, which is called Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. But they also talk about Lincoln's vision of political economy and some neat examples of Lincoln's shrewdness as a statesman. It's a really fantastic conversation. I encourage you to check it out. Podcast.hillsdale.edu. Click on The Larry Arnn Show for the new episode with Dr. Arnn and Alan C. Gelzo. You can also find it wherever you get your audio. We continue now with Dr. Miles Smith, his brand new book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. Dr. Smith, the chapter on the Sabbath. There are good stories in Religion and Republic, too. I'll ask you to tell the story briefly of the Sunday mail controversy and this fight that actually splits denominations across the country.
Yeah, so there was the United States ran mail on Sundays. The government ran its mail on Sundays. So, for example, if a government officer needed to talk to another government officer, that mail would still be delivered on Sundays. And in the end of the 1820s, beginning of the 1830s, this was controversial because a lot of ministers, particularly American, what we might call evangelicals, Congregationalists in New England, Presbyterians in the Middle States, were angry that the government would violate the Sabbath by doing work on Sundays. And so it gets to the point where there's a petition that leads to a congressional committee, and it's headed by future Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson. Richard Mentor Johnson was a Baptist and a relatively religious man, a church-going man at least, but he did not think the government had the right to say that because one group of people thought the Sabbath meant something, that the government was bound to that. And so he basically says, no, the government can run its mail on Sunday because, well, it's not everybody who tells us we can't. It's only one group of people who can tell us we can't. So yeah, that was actually really controversial. And there were, in fact, quite a few countries that didn't run their mail on Sunday. There was some debates over whether you could even fight a battle on a Sunday in the era. So yeah, it's strangely controversial. Richard Mentor Johnson's committee writes a famous report, but actually the Senate writes a report that doesn't actually square with Richard Mentor Johnson. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting controversy. Immigrant populations think it's weird. All the Germans arrive and they say, really? Why are they arguing over this? Doesn't seem a big deal. So
Dr. Miles Smith with us. Religion and Republic is the book, chapter on education from the founding to the Civil War. You say what's obvious is that almost no one wanted education to actually have a secular foundation. So much discussion today. I'll generalize a bit, but, we're not going to talk about the Bible in school. We're not going to have the Ten Commandments in school, et cetera, et cetera. If you walked into a school in 1840, what's the kind of education that you would expect, and what did Americans expect out of the educational system?
It would have seemed overwhelmingly religious to us. I think because they understood that the Western canon, how you were educated, was is essentially a sort of religious enterprise. Now, it wasn't a churchly enterprise. It wasn't something done by a church, but it was religious, meaning you understood that there were demands that philosophy and religion placed on you as you learned about them. And so, yeah, it would have seemed strangely religious to us. There were state universities, both in the North and South, that had officially, remember, these are state-paid guys, right? A state-paid professor of the evidences of Christianity. The University of Indiana has one. University of South Carolina has one. Various other schools have the same position, but they call it something differently. So it's essentially an understanding that Christianity has a necessary place in socio-intellectual catechesis. You can't actually be educated without learning why Christianity is important to education. That would have been something that was not really controversial at the time, even in state universities.
The book ends at the Civil War. There are many references throughout Religion and Republic that essentially say, but things change after the Civil War. Clearly, it's a big part of our history and a big breakpoint for many things in our history. How does religion change after that 1870s, 1880s as we approach the 20th century?
Yeah, that's my next book. No, I think I'll offer this. One of the big changes is that you have a far deeper wedding of America as an idea and religion as an idea in the aftermath of the Civil War. What's compelling to me is you have a deep wedding of Christianity and institutions in the era before the Civil War. But the idea of Christian America as we receive it, that's cooked up in the aftermath of the Civil War. Even people who would have been friendly to state churches, for example, in New England in the 1820s or 1830s, would not have had the same sort of almost symbiotic relationship between America and Christianity. They would have said America is a vehicle for certain Christian things. But the idea of a sort of savior nation, that's what's really kind of created in the aftermath of the Civil War. So yeah, it does change quite a bit.
The conclusion of Religion and Republic has some advice and thoughts about present day. Maintaining Christianity in civil and social institutions. You read about being good stewards of healthy and responsible Christian institutions, state level, municipal level, local level. We've seen recently a lot of Christian institutions even throw off that Christianity from their state admissions or how they act. What are some current, healthy, responsible Christian institutions that are worth saving?
Hillsdale College is one of those. I think Hillsdale is not a sectarian institution. We're not a church. We don't claim to be. But at the same time, we understand that Christianity has this kind of necessary place, this necessary role in education, and not merely in what we call education, but in philosophy and in our social and civil catechesis. It doesn't mean we want to preclude other religions at all, but we just understand Christianity has a necessary place. And so I think schools are a great example. There are, Catholic hospitals being able to take their Catholic faith seriously is another good example of this. So I think the call would be to steward that which we have well. It's not necessarily a call to go out and sort of create an ephemeral Christian nation where there isn't one. I don't know if there's that many people who would want a Christian nation. But I do think there's a lot of Catholics who would like their Catholic hospitals to be serious Catholic hospitals, and a lot of Baptists who would like their Baptist churches to be serious Baptist churches, and so on and so on. So some of it's just taking the institutions we have seriously as a necessary first step to thinking about a healthy relationship between religion and the Republic broadly.
I want to close with Dr. Miles Smith, his new book, Religion and Republic, by asking about something you didn't write, but is in the foreword to the book, Religion and Republic. Christianity is no longer a public truth. If anything, opposition to Christian beliefs, ethics, and morality is the new public truth. Have we reached a point in American society in which hostility to religion and Christianity is, in fact, rewarded societally?
Yeah, that was an excellent observation by Reverend Dr. Kevin DeYoung, who wrote the forward to the book. A book that's been published recently that I think is rightly sort of instigating a lot of important conversations is by Aaron Renn. And Aaron Renn is a blogger, and I think he historically has done urban policy, stuff like that. And Aaron Renn wrote an article at First Things that's been turned into a book, basically laying out a pattern of there was positive world, neutral world, and negative world. And what that meant was positive world is where it was pretty good. You were kind of given a little bit of a thumbs up for being a Christian in public life. A neutral world is where you weren't necessarily giving a thumbs up, but you weren't giving a thumbs down either. And negative world is where you're definitely given a thumbs down for being a sort of traditional or conservative Christian. And so I think that framework seems broadly right to me. Mr. Renn has a chronology that he assigns to it, but I do think we're at a place where to hold specific Christian commitments is now no longer even sort of a net neutral or net positive. It's seen as perhaps even antagonistic.
Well, right, it can be hate speech, right? This is the language we're going to use.
Yeah. It could be hate speech. And so it's now almost antagonistic to broad societal perceptions of the common good to be a conservative Christian, or even not even to be a practicing Christian, just to hold beliefs that happen to be synonymous with those held by conservative Christians. This is why you have so many people who sort of claim to be evangelicals who aren't church-going, who vote for Donald Trump or something like that. So I think even identification with certain things is seen as sort of a net negative.
Dr. Miles Smith, his new book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War. He's also assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College. Dr. Smith, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott.
Up next, we talk with Batya Ungar-Sargon. Her new book is Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. You can sign up to get an email every time there's a new episode of the program. Go to radiohour.hillsdale.edu and click the subscribe button. We're joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon. She is the author of Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women, also opinion editor at Newsweek. Batya, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is such an interesting book, and we'll talk about the details inside, but the main thrust of it is finding and talking to the American working class. So how and where did you find the American working class and the interview subjects for this book?
It's such a great question. People ask me this all the time, and I realize now I should have included a little bit more about the methodology in the introduction because it is really interesting. This was definitely the biggest challenge. Of course, once you find somebody with an interesting story, any monkey can take down their story and relate it to people, right? Because they've done the work by living the interesting life. So what I wanted was to find individuals whose stories were interesting enough to carry a narrative, but also who were representative of larger trends in the working class. And so I started with the data, and there's this wonderful professor at Brigham Young University called Joe Price, and he has a team of grad students, and he will allow them to work with journalists and help us, people like me whose PhDs are in English literature and are not great at numbers, help us understand the data that's out there so that we can make sense of what we're seeing. And so I asked them to look at the American census survey and to compare 2000 to 2020 so I could get a sense of what the trends were as they were developing. And so what they did was they created this unbelievable spreadsheet for me, which was full of quantitative data, including who is the working class from a racial point of view. How much money do people make? What occupations are they working in? How many people are in each occupation? What is the home ownership rate? Which occupations give the highest home ownership rate? All of this amazing data. Where do people live? Where are they congregating? Where is the American dream more likely to exist for working class people? And once I had that data in hand, I could then go out and start looking for people who fit the sort of larger trends that I was seeing, so that I wasn't just cherry picking only interesting people. And I could know that the people I was finding and the stories they were telling me were actually representative of these larger data trends.
Through the first part of the book, when you talk to some of these working class people across the country, you say there are a few themes that emerge across these interviews: the value of hard work and the frustration with people choosing not to work and relying more on government benefits. How did this idea of work, the value of work, people should be working, how does that become part of this feeling inside the American working class?
The people I interviewed to a person were extremely proud of their work. They saw hard work as an almost spiritual inheritance that they had received from their parents. They remembered seeing their parents get dressed every morning and go to work, and they got a lot of dignity and pride and self-esteem from their work. And this was a constant, and it made me all the more angry at the elites, really on both sides, whose worldview is completely based on the idea that people want to be liberated from work, or that there are certain jobs that are beneath the dignity of an American, and that we should, resolve to free people from having to do them. I really believe that the policy that we've seen over the last 40, 50 years, especially from the Democrats, is the product of an elite education where people go to universities and develop extreme contempt for people who work with their hands and who do jobs for a living that they consider, that these elites consider to be beneath contempt, like cleaning toilets or taking care of the elderly or driving a truck or working in manufacturing. Because the elites would rather die than do those jobs, they see them as having no value and then proceeded to devalue them through policy that made these jobs no longer provide a dignified wage. And there was such a gap between the way that the elites think and talk about work and the way that working class people do. This was one of the most infuriating things that I encountered while reporting this book.
You also say that most of the people you talked to had these traits of extreme moderation, tolerance, practicality, and they're appalled at the divisiveness of politics. Do you worry, or did you notice that these Americans are then disconnected from the political process because they simply can't put up with what they're hearing and seeing?
There's a huge disconnect. Most people are totally apolitical because neither party is speaking in a language that means anything to them or makes any sense to them. I'll just give you a few examples. So the vast majority of people I interviewed, and this includes Democrats and Republicans, it includes, atheists and Christians, were extremely pro-gay. I met a lot of Christians who have a gay person in their life who they want to be treated with dignity and respect and who they hoped would find love. They were also, to a person, extremely worried about the transgender agenda, especially when it comes to sports, to bathrooms, to children, to schools. So, which side is really speaking to their issues? Neither, because in the political realm and in the media realm, there's this thing called LGBTQ that lumps together, middle-class gay people raising families and drag queens performing for children. But that makes no sense to the average American, to your average working class American. Gay people are part of their community, and drag queens performing for children is an abomination, right? So which side is speaking their language? Neither side. And this was the case not just of cultural issues, but this was the case on actual policy. So for example, the most common combination of views that I encountered, whether from Democrats or Republicans in the working class, was a desire for something close to a complete moratorium on immigration for the foreseeable future and some sort of government-backed healthcare. They hated to see people going bankrupt from medical bills. They felt deeply how unfair it was that they worked so hard with their bodies and they felt they couldn't afford quality health care. And they were very, very upset about that and didn't understand why that was. And they also felt that immigrants were coming here and getting preferential treatment and were driving down their wages and were being given a lot of benefits at their expense that they were paying for with their taxpayer dollars. So which party should they vote for, right? There's one party that cares about immigration, is talking about policing the border, but will never talk about healthcare. And there's another party that will talk about healthcare, but has actively and intentionally opened the border, right? It's a total crapshoot. Each party has one piece of their agenda and is actively undermining the other piece of it. And as a result, people are extremely disconnected from politics. Now, I will say that Donald Trump is the exception here. A lot of the working class people I spoke to felt that he did speak their language. He understood where they were at in terms of policy. And even a lot of the Democrats that I interviewed who didn't vote for him admitted to me that he had put money in their pockets.
Batya Ungar-Sargon is with us. Second Class is her book, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. You mentioned in these discussions that there's this feeling that you can do everything right. You can make the right decisions. You can go to the right schools, perhaps. You can take the right jobs and still only have a 50-50 shot of making it in the U.S. Does that become something that is depressing? Does it bring these people down? Does it inspire them to work even harder? How do you feel that they are dealing with that realization?
You know, one of the worst parts is they actually don't have a lot of sort of class resentment. Most people blame themselves whenever anything goes wrong. There is this feeling of, oh, if I could have just worked harder, if I were smarter, I could have made it. But in the back of their minds, they will say, you know, we know a lot of people who made all the right decisions and still didn't make it. There's just a lot of resignation, a lot of despair, a lot of sort of incomprehension about how it can be that you can work 12 hours a day in back-breaking labor and still every month have to call the electric company and come up with a payment plan so they don't turn off the lights on you and your children. It's really unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable to any religious people. It should be unacceptable to conservatives, to liberals. I mean, the idea that the people who work so much harder than us, who make our cushy lives in the knowledge industry possible because of their physical labor, makes them unable to achieve the most modest version of a stable life. This is completely unacceptable. And if it doesn't offend you morally, it is a huge threat to a stable democracy, because we have right now an oligarchy of the credentialed. You cannot have a stable democracy without a strong middle class. And so we really are threatening the very foundations of this society by allowing this kind of gross inequality to persist.
Batya Ungar-Sargon is here. Second Class is her book, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. You mentioned immigrants with regards to wages, and one of the questions you try to get at in Second Class is why did the working class wages stagnate over time? What did you find?
So if you look at the sort of high watermark for working class wages, it was around 1971. They started to stagnate after that and really drop precipitously. And here's an interesting thing that I found. The elites, the college-educated elites on the left, they like to rail against the billionaire class. But if you compare the share of the GDP controlled by the billionaires in 1971 to the share of the GDP controlled by the billionaire class today, it actually has not changed that much. The real shift has been from the middle class, which used to control the largest share of the GDP in the 70s, to the top 20% who today control over 50% of the GDP. So while this top 20% of over-credentialed, multiple degreed, college-educated elites loves to rail against the billionaires, it is actually they who have seen the largest upward transfer of wealth from the working class. And this was done very intentionally through policy implemented first by President Bill Clinton, then by President Barack Obama, and now by President Joe Biden. And you can really follow their economic policy and see how it has been an upward transfer of wealth and an absolute plunder of the middle class on behalf of the college-educated elites. So it started with NAFTA, where we took 5 million really good paying manufacturing jobs and shipped them overseas to China and Mexico to build up their middle class. And then President Obama defunded vocational training, which was a huge avenue of upward mobility for working class Americans. And to this day, if you work in the skilled trades and you are a working class American, you will be living the American dream more likely than not. You will be a homeowner, you will have a retirement set aside, and your children will have more choices than you did. And then, of course, President Biden opened the border and welcomed in, 10, 15 million illegal immigrants to compete with working class Americans in the industries that they're already struggling in. It's very hard for us to remember, but, in the 70s, trucking, being a manicurist, cleaning hotel rooms, these were all jobs that could secure a working class person the American dream. You could be a homeowner, you could live modestly, but with a lot of security. And that is no longer the case as a result of offshoring of manufacturing, the importing of millions and millions and millions of migrants into the service industry specifically. And then, of course, the downgrading of vocational training. These were all big pieces of the puzzle. I would also say that, the housing market has been a huge impediment to working class Americans achieving the American dream. When you think about owning a home as being a central facet of that stable middle class life that we want everybody to be able to achieve. And that is the result of things like housing laws, zoning laws that were implemented by and large by rich liberals who wanted to protect the values of their properties. And so they instituted zoning laws where you can only build single family detached homes in their neighborhoods, which means that there are no starter homes for working class Americans, no duplexes, no triple deckers. All of these are pieces of the puzzle. Trade policy had a huge impact on the working class. Elites don't talk a lot or think a lot about tariffs, but working class people think about tariffs a lot because they associate free trade really with downward mobility for themselves. And then I would say there's also a big cultural component to this. I think the idea of masculinity has become, toxic, that the culture, which is very much controlled by the woke left, has downgraded the very idea of being a man and criminalized masculinity, machismo, providing and being a provider and being a man who is seen and respected by his community. These are all things that have been really erased and downgraded and criminalized in our culture. And as a result, there's a big spiritual crisis plaguing working class men that's really having an impact as well.
The cost of housing is a big deal. The devaluation of working class jobs through immigration, these are themes that exist throughout second class. But I want to ask about the idea that jobs require college degrees. There are wonderful stories throughout second class, and perhaps we haven't talked too much or haven't talked enough about those. I love meeting Earl, this guy in the second half of the book who started a cleaning business, quickly learned the difference between cleaning women's and men's bathrooms and what each gender preferred when he cleaned them. So, jobs like that, do too many jobs in the country require college degrees? Should we rethink some of those requirements and perhaps open the workforce to more working class Americans?
100%. It should be illegal to require a college degree for a job that does not require a specific skill you can point to that a candidate would have picked up in college. And worse than that is that many, many corporations use software that immediately funnels out anyone without a degree. So they can't even get an interview and show the interviewer what their disposition is like, what their skill set is like, what their opportunity should be based on the kinds of experience that they have. And, right now we're seeing all of these, just totally spoiled, safetyist, despicable college students chanting and protesting on behalf of a genocidal terrorist group. Those kids are all going to be making $90,000, $100,000 a year at their first jobs. Those people are going to be making $1 million on average over the course of their career just because their parents paid $90,000 for them a year to get this credential, just because they were born into a system that for some reason has decided that piece of paper is worth $1 million. It's so appalling. And you meet Americans who want to work so hard and yet simply cannot get their foot in the door because of these degree requirements.
What about unions? There's a section toward the end of second class about unions, and a lot of discussion these days, certainly with the UAW getting more involved and unionizing the Volkswagen plant recently down in the South. Are public sector unions and or private sector unions the answer to some of what ails America's working class?
So if you ask me, I think it's undeniable that unions secure better wages, better protections, more training, pensions, and benefits that, irrefutably make working class life easier. However, working class Americans clearly don't agree with me en masse, because despite the fact that unions have a lot of popularity right now, there are not mass organization efforts that are succeeding across the country. Unions, American working class people do not see them as the avenue towards a better future. Think about the fact that just 6% of the private sector is unionized, and that just is not changing. I mean, even if you got all of this stuff passed that the liberals want to pass, how much higher could it get, right? 7%, 10%. This is not going to be a mass movement. There has to be other ways that we can improve working class life. There are many reasons that working class people don't see unions as the answer. Some of them are cultural. The national leadership of unions is extremely woke and very tightly tied to the Democratic Party, whereas most working class people are no longer Democrats. And so there's a big cultural divide there. There's also some union busting. Yes, it does exist. Although that's not the reason that working class people give for not joining unions. There's another piece of the puzzle, which is that in the 90s, the unions, the national unions, just like the Democratic Party, did a 180 on immigration and began to say that they represent illegal immigrants as well as Americans. And I think that was a huge, huge mistake, because it signaled to working class people that the unions were going to stand with the direct competition. And I think that's really when you started to see huge drop off. You also have, a culture in the South that's workers in the South don't want to belong to unions. They're very individualistic. They don't want to have a kind of adversarial relationship with their bosses. Americans are very entrepreneurial. We think of ourselves as, good workers. We like to work hard. So for all those reasons, despite the fact that, unions are extremely important and do extremely important work, I don't think that they are going to be the avenue that helps us rescue the working class.
Second Class is the book, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. Batya Ungar-Sargon is the author. You talk with these people you profile in the first half. In the second half, about some of the proposed solutions to help America's working class. What were the solutions that most resonated with these people you talked with?
Getting rid of zoning laws. If we did that, we could build 1 million units a year, and within 10 years, we could solve the housing crisis. That was a really big one. I would go to experts, from different sides of the political spectrum and gather a whole bunch of solutions and then bring them back to the working class people I was interviewing and give them, a range of options. That one had a lot of purchase. People really liked that idea because they felt that they really did not want things like vouchers. They didn't want affordable housing. They didn't want Section 8. They work really hard, and there was something in them that rebelled at the idea of being given government handouts or needing government handouts. But they liked the idea of increasing the supply. They felt that made a lot of sense. Getting rid of degree requirements was another really big one. Trade policy that favors American workers. They were in favor of tariffs. Extremely limiting the number of immigrants coming into the country was a big one. Vocational training in schools was a really big one. And then some kind of affordable healthcare. People felt that healthcare had gotten just unbelievably expensive, and they didn't like that they worked so hard physically with their bodies and they could not be assured of good healthcare. And a lot of their savings every year that they managed to cobble together would go to healthcare costs, which is why they don't have anything saved for retirement.
Batya Ungar-Sargon is the author of Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. The book is available now. Batya, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you so much for having me. God bless you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Miles Smith, his new book, Religion and Republic, Christian America from the Founding to the Civil War, and Batya Ungar-Sargon, her book, Second Class. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.